Hi, and welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the third one in this series. We'll be exploring the work of the German latter 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And before we get started, I guess here's a tradition. Here's our somewhat goofy hat. Maybe this isn't too goofy. This is actually a hat from the university where I work. So go West, go Wolves. That's our slogan here at West Georgia. So at any rate, let's touch base with where we were in the previous video. So in the previous video, we were looking basically at a bunch of ideas that derive from Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, which in turn is his way of trying to foster the dynamics of overcoming, both with respect to the larger collective element of our lives, but also with respect to the individual element of our lives. And in that regard, he draws a distinction between what he calls a master morality and a slave morality. In the previous video, I started that off with a quote that wasn't from your reading assignment from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but came from a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and from the introduction. And the quote went something like this: well, all great things must first wear terrifying and monstrous masks in order to inscribe themselves on the heart of humanity. And maybe I want to start off this video by mentioning something that maybe I didn't put enough emphasis on in the previous video, which is, although Nietzsche at that point in Beyond Good and Evil is talking about the wearing of masks in a much more sort of collective or social or cultural way, that there's a very individual way of hearing that quote too. For instance, think about moments in your life where something great was upon you, or you were approaching perhaps something great, and wonder about how often that great thing must first have appeared to you to seem terrifying and monstrous in order to inscribe itself on your own heart before you could eventually live through it and maybe eventually expand your way of being in your perceptual field in some important way. So probably all great things at a personal level also must wear terrifying and monstrous masks in order to inscribe themselves deeply enough into our own hearts. So that was one thing I wanted to point out. And the other thing I wanted to mention before we launch into the material for this video is that this distinction between master and slave morality at first seems like a distinction between those who have power and those who do not have power in a very crude way. Of course, in antiquity, we were talking about antiquity last time, the way that that really crystallized was in terms of those who were literal masters and those who were literal slaves. But in our own era, and also in Nietzsche's time, there are very few literal masters and literal slaves out there in the world, although occasionally, yes, there are pockets of it throughout the world. But much more commonly, the way this plays out is in terms of our subjectivity. So what it has to do with is being perhaps a slave in your mind being enslaved, and your perceptions and your values being essentially oriented toward those that would align themselves with a slave-like devotion, or on the other hand, being a master in your mind, the master of your perceptions, and so on and so forth. So from that point of view, we shouldn't be too quick to map master morality onto something crude like maybe having a ton of money or having political power or something like that. And we also shouldn't be very quick to align slave morality with the opposite of that, because probably most of you watching this video are college students, and probably your first thought is like, wow, I hardly have any power compared to the larger scale of how power is allotted within our society. You know, if you're eating lots of ramen noodles and stuff like that, well, it may seem that you're condemned to a kind of slavish relation to the world, but from the point of view of Nietzsche's analysis, that's not even close to being true. The fact of the matter is slavishness has mostly to do with your values and your attitude and your posture toward life. So it's entirely possible to be, let's say, a 20-year-old undergraduate student and yet be the master of your destiny, the master of your mind, the master of your perception and values. Not that that's necessarily common, but it's entirely possible. On the other hand, you may be a very rich and famous and popular person and be a slave, in essence, along all of those dimensions. And probably you don't have to look too far into the workings of political power, I think would be the most obvious way of seeing this, that, boy, our politicians, how often are they feeling like they have to sort of say the correct thing and, read the correct thing off the teleprompter and all of that kind of stuff, which is essentially a way of deferring to the predominant values that are running throughout our culture, which may or may not be the actual values held by the politician in question, but basically having to kowtow to other people's idols and other people's gods and other people's golden calves and so on and so forth in order to grasp and maintain political power. And I think the answer to that would be, well, that happens a lot. Celebrities, same kind of thing. Within our larger culture, if you find yourself within a culture where, in essence, victims, if you play the victim well enough, you're almost instantaneously turned into a kind of hero or allotted more power or something like that. You're living in a culture dominated through and through by a slave morality. On the other hand, if you're kind of a winner and you're all right with being a winner and you're sort of proud of being a winner, and well, if you're living in a culture where that is almost immediately something suspect or something at least morally not quite right for people to go around and feel good about their advantages or good about their privilege or something like that, well, then, once again, if you're living in a culture like that, you can be pretty well assured that you're living in a culture dominated by a slave morality and not a master morality. Because remember, the big distinction from the last video was a slave morality is about inverting, turning upside down the normal scale of values that a master morality is about. And what those scale of values is about is something like, if you have power to fulfill your desires and your will to power is more or less unblocked in any way, and then, the good is simply to fulfill your desires as you care to. And the bad is to not be able to do that. Well, from the point of view of a slave morality, the evil, which is a different category than the bad, what makes evil different, by the way, is that evil is not only undesirable, okay, but is worthy of condemnation on top of that. The bad, from the point of view of master morality, is simply that which is undesirable. So it's undesirable to be a slave, either literally or in your mind, from the point of view of a master morality. But from the point of view of a slave morality, like all those things are what is desirable. And moreover, the attributes of the master morality are not only undesirable, but worthy of some kind of condemnation. Okay, so there's something different, and that's what evil is about. Okay, all of that stuff, I guess I'm elaborating a little bit on what I talked about last time and expanding upon it, but hopefully summarizing it mostly too. So here comes the new stuff. So at this point, Nietzsche, what he does is he notices that the predominant morality of Europe during the 19th century, and probably by extension our own dominant morality, for the most part is a Christian morality. And at least in Europe, okay, and your cultures that are derived from Europe, which the United States culture largely is. And of course, it's hard not to notice that, well, early Christianity was it developed under conditions of oppression and slavery. Most obviously, if you read the Bible with any frequency at all, the New Testament that is, under the Roman Empire. Okay, so under the Roman Empire, and so you have characters like Pontius Pilate and people like that running roughshod over the population, in essence. Christian morality, in its origins, was one of these slave moralities. It was a way of trying to live through difficult, oppressive times and to find a moral ordering of the world that helped that process by inverting the scale of values, so that the masters would end up being evil in some sense, and the people who were enslaved, whose will to power was blocked, would end up being good people. So according to that, okay, so let's go through a few things to help you sort of appreciate that a little bit. So in your notes, I'm looking at your notes a little bit, like the Ten Commandments, okay, so the Ten Commandments, well, normally we think of that as a template for Christian morality, although I guess it came from the Old Testament, not the New, but at any rate, Second Covenant, sort of things got rearranged a little bit. But still, the Ten Commandments as a template for at least a version of Christian morality. And I realize that there are different renderings of the Ten Commandments and interpretations of them, but pretty much in all of them, the majority of the commandments are telling you what not to do. Okay, so that thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not commit murder, depending upon your translation. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not make graven images or idols. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Like all these things that you might want to do if you have an unblocked will to power, you might be, in some sense, okay with, let's say, coveting your neighbor's house or making idols or something like that. So in the most common rendering of the Ten Commandments, 8 of the 10 are about giving you orders about what you will not do. Okay, and then 2 of them are more positive. And the 2 that are more positive are, remember the Sabbath. And even there you can, I suppose, wonder whether that could be translated, don't forget the Sabbath. Okay, but let's take it, let's be conservative about it. So remember the Sabbath, and then honor thy mother and thy father. Okay, so those are the 2 sort of positive commandments, and the others are telling you what not to do. Well, isn't that sort of odd when you think about it, that 80% of the commandments, of the 10 commandments, are about hemming in what you might naturally want to do, like at some point in your life. Okay, so another marker, like pride, okay, in the Bible is one of the deadly sins. Pride goeth before the fall, okay, from the Bible, it's sort of a reflection on, I guess, classical Greek tragedy, the idea of hubris within classical Greek tragedy, sort of a biblical rendering of the same idea. So why is pride such an awful thing? Because from the master's point of view, master morality point of view, pride is a perfectly natural thing. It's like, well, when you have powers and you're taking delight in them, probably one of the natural emotional correlates of that would probably be to feel some measure of pride in your abilities and your accomplishments and your unblocked will to power and what you're getting out of life and so on and so forth. Well, why is pride such a deadly sin? Well, because it's the kind of thing that masters do. Like masters, part of what differentiates a master from a slave is not just that the master has an unblocked will to power and is able to satisfy his or her desires in a more or less direct way. Like at the point of subjectivity, at the level of subjectivity, part of what makes master morality is masters don't feel bad about any of that. In fact, they're likely to feel good about it. So they feel good about being masters. They feel good about their powers and their advantage and their privilege and all of that kind of stuff. So pride, definitely, and taking pride to be a kind of deadly sin is, once again, a way of inverting that normal, sort of straightforward, almost childlike scale of values that you find in master morality. So another marker in the Bible. So, there's this aphorism in the Bible about how it's, let's see, I'll try to get it reasonably right. It's a rich man's getting into heaven is about as probable as a camel passing through the eye of a needle. All right, so it's about as hard for a rich man, like someone who probably is more likely to, sort of revel in these sensations of pride and mastery and so on, and unblocked will to power. That makes it a lot harder to get into heaven. In fact, almost impossible when you think about that camel passing through an eye of a needle. Oh, I put that in your notes. I thought I was just sort of pulling it out of the air, but it's in your notes. That's cool. Okay, so financial advantage, financial privilege becomes something evil, or at least something that makes it very difficult to be virtuous. In contrast, it's the meek. Okay, so the meek shall inherit the earth, we're told in the Bible. So what about meekness? Well, meekness means that when you're injured, you turn the other cheek. All right, in essence, that you're willing to forgive and forget when life offends you, or more likely when your fellow human beings offend you in some way, that eventually the meek will get theirs, even if it's not obvious that they're getting it in the moment. So like when you turn the other cheek, what would a master do in that case? Well, a master, if a master is offended by other people, probably he's going to hit back, or she is going to hit back, right? So the natural sort of childlike impulse is like, if someone hits you, you hit them back. You don't turn the other cheek, you hit back. And from the point of view of a master morality, sort of the payoff there is that you don't have to, you can let go of the sensation of pain and resentment you might otherwise feel. The problem with turning the other cheek, of course, is that your anger, which is a very natural reaction you might have to be, let's say you're being hit. Let's sort of make it the easiest possible example. You know, like someone hits you, and if you turn the other cheek so that they can hit the other cheek too, well, the problem with that paradigm is that probably your anger is going to be internalized. You won't be getting it out immediately and letting it go by striking back, or at least trying to strike back at whoever it is that hit you. So when you strike back at someone that hit you, you really can forget the event. Why? Because you probably haven't internalized a lot of the irritation and anger and resentment you would otherwise feel. When you turn the other cheek, and a lot of bullies will hit the other cheek, is the fact of the matter. It's not like the majority of bullies in this world, or oppressors in this world, will stop after hitting one cheek and have this moment of sort of deep epiphany type reflection and say, well, he's turning the other cheek, maybe I can be a better person. Probably that's rare, I would guess, at least in my experience of life. Usually oppressors, they would want you to turn the other cheek so they can smack you around as much as they possibly can. Well, the problem with that is that at some point it's only going to fuel your resentment, not only of the bully, but ultimately of life. And you're going to be looking for one of these ways of inverting the scale and, that sort of thing. So what's the main point? The main point right now is like Nietzsche's rendering of Christian morality, which for him is the dominant morality in the Western world during the 19th century, is in terms of a slave morality. That basically, and if you think about like how often, images of docility and obedience to the Lord, like think about that in terms of these categories, master and slave. Like, is Christian morality really mostly about sort of inculcating a kind of slave-like or slavish obedience and docility, and getting people to sort of be that way? Well, think of some of the main metaphors, like obedience to the Lord, or here's one, like viewing people as a flock of sheep, and I guess the people at the head, ultimately Jesus would be the shepherd in some way. Well, it seems like a lot of those metaphors are really about, once again, sort of getting people to behave in a slavish way, in a slave-like way, and not just merely behave from the point of view of sort of their externally observable behavior, but ultimately in terms of their subjectivity, because that's where power really works. You getting it? Like, that's where power really sort of has a cutting edge, more so than your ability to force people to behave in a certain way. Because, like, if you get people to think in a certain way and perceive in a certain way and value in a certain way, you never have to engage these cruder formations of power in the first place. You never have to send your army over to subjugate some people in a foreign land if you can get them thinking and perceiving along that terrain, if they're enslaved along that terrain of subjectivity, you never have to engage financial type power, political type power, military type power, any of these cruder formations of power, because people are already thinking and consequently doing what you want them to do anyhow. Like, that's the real, sort of place where power operates. And I would say, to make this more topical and relevant to our times, especially since we're in a political period at this point in the United States, at any rate, wonder about how much of that is going on within popular culture and the nightly news and that sort of thing. Like, what fraction of it is about trying to get you to kowtow to someone else's false idols, kowtow to someone else's hollow tin gods, kowtow to someone else's agenda. Well, that only really works from the point of view of, getting you to behave like a slave, where you're not the master of your own mind. See, this is part of why, a slight digression, all right, spontaneous digression. I think, as I look across the political landscape, this one might get slightly incendiary, sorry about that. I think that the most hated person in our world today, at least in the United States, is the independent thinker. The most hated and despised person in our country, the United States, is the person who is willing to think for himself or herself, right? Who is somehow detached him or herself from this slave-like obedience to someone's political agenda. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a right-wing political agenda or a left-wing political agenda or even a centrist political agenda, but someone who's willing to sort of let his or her thinking span across that wide terrain without being enslaved to any damn agenda. And I would suggest to you, because most of you are young people watching this, that might be a better avenue for your development as a human being, and hopefully a thinking human being, to aspire not to be like a correctly programmed damn puppet, like, oh, I'm going to espouse this and I'm going to say the right thing, but like to lay claim to the master, sorry about that, it probably looks spastic as hell, but to lay claim to the mastery of your own mind, okay? To lay claim to like a deep mastery of your own perceptual field, your own values, that you won't just sort of go along, but that you're going to sort of sort things out for yourself. I would suggest that to you as a possible way of taking up this idea, even if you are eating a lot of ramen noodles. Like, you can still see, that's the point. That's why I sort of mentioned this at the beginning. Like, even if you don't have a ton of money, if you feel like, well, I'm on the low end of this sort of mastery slavery spectrum, but here's the thing. You can become a master of your own perceptions. You can become the master of your own life. You can become the master of your own values. You don't have to just sort of head down one sort of, how they sort of get cattle to go through these what is it, troughs or whatever they're called. Like, you don't have to be, that doesn't have to be sort of your paradigm for life. You can become the most hated person in the land, which I'm suggesting to you might be a good thing, to become something like an independent thinker, neither progressive nor conservative nor centrist, but someone who's willing to range freely, like a free range thinker, all right, like a free range thinker, rather than, just like cattle following the ass of the cattle in front of you and all that. Okay, so, end of sidebar rant. That might be qualify as a semi-rant or something like that. But it's in the spirit of this analysis, all right? Trying to make it real for you, trying to make it breathe for you a little bit in the 21st century. All right, so let's get back to sort of your notes and that kind of stuff. So Christian morality, the thing about Christian morality is, besides being a slave morality from the point of view of Nietzsche's analysis, is that it too has a will to power. Okay, so people in conditions of enslavement, either literal enslavement or, more importantly, enslavement along that terrain of subjectivity, still have a will to power. They still want to be powerful. But the thing is, like, if you've inverted the scale of values and adopted a slave morality, that becomes sort of difficult to admit, right? So they still want power, but the problem is that they can't really admit it. So that's why these masks have to be put on. Now, from the point of view of Nietzsche's analysis, one of the main masks within the Christian form of slave morality has to do with covering over, the sensations of resentment of people whose power is unblocked, who will think for themselves, let's say, and not even feel bad about it, or who aren't manipulable via the dynamics of shame. I think that in our own culture these days, like the main way that I would say, this is not Nietzsche, this is me, that power operates across the train of subjectivity is via the dynamics of shaming people. Cultural anthropologists sometimes divide different kinds of societies into a guilt-driven society as opposed to a shame-driven society as opposed to a fear-driven society. So this distinction comes to us by way of cultural anthropology. And I think that more and more we're becoming a shame-driven society. Normally the culture of the United States is not numbered among the shame-driven societies. So the way they usually describe it, the prime example is Japan, usually, like a shame-driven society. But I think that more and more we're becoming mostly a shame-driven society. And of course the idea there is to control people, okay, by shaming them and turning them into good docile slaves, basically. Well, I think what I'm trying to get at in this lecture, perhaps by way of subtext, is that maybe you shouldn't be content with being a slave. Okay, let's just get like really blunt and direct about this. Like maybe that's actually a poor paradigm for your one unduplicatable and infinitely precious life on planet Earth. That's maybe a substandard paradigm for your life, shall we say. Well, I would think it would be for you to be like a properly programmed computer, and my goodness, come on, your soul is deeper than that. Like seriously, and if you don't believe it, look into yourself. Try looking into yourself and see how deeply you can see into what you really are, and then make a judgment on that basis whether that paradigm of enslavement and sort of shame-driven obedience is really commensurate with the depth of what you really are as a human being. Just a little exercise in case you need a new hobby. All right, so let's see, what else did I want to mention? Oh, I sort of skipped over something. So in the genealogy of morals, I should probably make note of this because it's really it can be like a bolt of lightning. In the book, The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche at one point, he just sort of busts out with this really multi-page long quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so medieval major theologian for sure throughout the entire history of Christianity, St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so he's quoting actually in Latin, in the original Latin, because let's remember Nietzsche was a philologist, so he knew his Latin, of course. A long multi-page quote in Latin from the Summa Theologica. In case you don't know what that is, that was like a kind of encyclopedic type work consisting of many volumes produced by Aquinas during the medieval period about all kinds of different questions pertinent to Christian worldview and so on. So at one point in this quote, what the quote is about is, it's translated for you, by the way, if you buy the English version. The quote is about the question of what makes heaven so great, okay? And the reason why that's a question is because, in the Western world we have many very detailed illustrations of what makes hell so bad. Okay, so Dante, I think, Dante has one of the better ones, so hell consists of different torments, different circles within circles, and each circle has like a different kind of torment, and then the centermost circle is a frozen version of hell, which is a little bit different from how we normally think about hell. Normally we think about hell in terms of like being burned infinitely to death. Okay, sorry, camera turned off again. So we were talking about this quote from Aquinas, Nietzsche's, excuse me, quoting Aquinas at length. about what the chief pleasure of heaven is, because it's not necessarily evident what it is. Unlike the torments of hell, which we have in the West, like a very detailed, grotesque, almost in its level of detail, descriptions of. If you want a graphic illustration, check out some Hieronymus Bosch paintings, B-O-S-C-H, Hieronymus Bosch paintings from, let's see, when did he live? I think he was sort of like around the Renaissance type period. Don't hold me to that, but I think around then. So if you want some illustrations of hell, okay, so we have a lot of detail about what makes hell so bad, but not much detail about what makes heaven so great. Well, we have a couple things. It's like, well, harp music. Like you listen to a lot of harp music in heaven, so that's in terms of our sort of cultural illustration of what heaven might be like. And let's see, okay, you get to be at the right hand of God. I guess that would be cool. There seems to be some detail lacking in that. So you're listening to a lot of harp music, you're getting to be at the right hand of God. That would be a good thing. What else? I guess a lot of stern lectures about, sort of the righteousness of moral rectitude. Okay, so you're going to be spending eternity in this environment. So what are you really heading toward? Well, okay, a lot of harp music, sitting at the right hand of God, and a lot of stern lectures about the value of moral rectitude. See, I think that most people would probably get bored with that after, 10,000 years of that and that only. So the question is still out there, well, what makes heaven so great? So Aquinas takes up this question, and his answer is that, well, ultimately, what makes heaven so great is that you get to look down into hell at all these souls writhing in eternal torment, and so you get to witness all those people that oppressed you, that were unrepentant sinners and who didn't even have the human decency to feel bad about it. They took pride in their powers. You get to witness all of these dissolute Roman emperors and everyday sort of jerk-offs or whatever, writhing in eternal torment and these medieval type tortures, like getting their flesh stripped off and their eyes poked out and that being eviscerated like infinitely over and over and over again, that the chief pleasure of heaven is getting to look down from heaven and witness that forever, like an eternal kind of sort of Freddy Krueger, or sorry, that's such an old school example. I wish I had a new one, like an eternal sort of like horror movie, sort of thing, eternally. And so Aquinas says, well, that's what really makes heaven so great, is you get to see like all those people that really pissed you off and irritated you during your lifetime be tormented eternally. And so Nietzsche's take on this is, well, what a moment of honesty is his first sort of take on it. Like, yeah, okay, so he's admitting it, that really, like, that's sort of what it's about, is like a kind of hatred, a kind of seething underlying resentment, probably from having turned your cheek too many times and internalizing all of that irritation and resentment and sense of oppression and feeling like a victim and all that sort of, that huge sort of ball of emotional negativity, finally getting to feel like it's in the driver's seat. And it's the one witnessing the eternal torments of the damned. And that's really the pleasure, that the whole sort of way of seeing life and the metal life and all of that, that really it's about that. It's really about like finding a way of seeing things where eventually it offers up the promise that you're going to get to see the people that you really hate. Oh, you just really hate those people, be tortured infinitely. And so then the Nietzschean sort of question is, well, if that's really sort of what's going on at some level, then maybe all of this talk about love, like Christian love, and loving your neighbor and all of that kind of stuff, maybe really what's going on is that that's mostly a mask, once again, for an underlying resentment, animosity, and hatred of people who didn't act like slaves, who were in positions in one way or another, either literally or more subjectively. They just did whatever they want, and you hate them for it. And so all the talk about love and, God's love. I mean, it is a strange thing when you think about it. It's like, well, so God's love eventuates in the eternal torture of souls. Like, that's sort of an odd, well, I guess there are forms of love that are like that, like sort of an S&M model perhaps for love. But, so really is the whole sort of apparatus based upon an S&M type? I think SM is actually the correct nomenclature. Model of what love is about, so that ultimately it's about, eternal torture. That seems like an odd expression of love, like eternal torture. Now that's what I call tough love. Eternal torture forever. Tough love. All right, but at any rate, so once again, let's sort of remind ourselves of what Nietzsche's project is the hermeneutic of suspicion. So, like these sorts of observations are, he's formulating them in a way that might invite you to become suspicious of what might otherwise be the straightforward virtue of the world we inhabit. Okay, so the main template of Christian virtue. Although I would say, to be honest, this might be another sidebar moment. Like if Nietzsche were alive today, he probably wouldn't be attacking Christian morality quite so vehemently. I think that if he, his desire to intensify the dynamics of overcoming would probably take a critique of not so much Christian virtue as our easy deference to the overarching template of commodity and entertainment culture, because I think that's really the set of dynamics that for the most part forms the value basis of our relation to life, more so even than the Christian sort of slave morality from his point of view template. But at any rate, that's me opinionating about Nietzsche. Okay, so let's see, resentment. So the whole slave morality is based on resentment of people that are in positions of mastery, or more importantly, that are in their own minds, that are masters of their own minds. This is part of why I said I think that in our day and age, the free thinker is in a way the most hated person on the planet, because like the free thinker really is the master of his or her own values, his or her own perceptions and so on, and refuses to kowtow to slavery either on the right or slavery on the left or slavery in the middle. Like the real master will wander where the master wants to go, and not where other people want you to go. I feel slightly subversive as a professor at moments like this. Okay, summational statement, because this video is already getting long, or possibly too long. So here's Nietzsche's take on Christian morality. He finds it to be decadent, is his word. Okay, so, and that's sort of a reversal of the way you might think about it, because it's like, well, sort of the puritanical element of Christian morality doesn't seem decadent. Well, he finds it's decadent because it's inimical to the basic process of life, and of course for him the basic process of life is the will to power. So it's a denial of the basic reality of human existence. And so it's decadent in that sense. It falls down. The word decadent, we get the word decadent from two words in Latin. Okay, so the CAD part comes from a verb that means to fall, and de in Latin is a preposition that means down from. Okay, so it's a falling down from the reality of life, a denial of it. But now here's the other thing about Nietzsche, is he's rarely monolithically consistent across works. So at other points, he talks about how Christian morality is a wonderful thing, and the reason why is because it's telling a really interesting, almost aesthetically appealing, almost a lie. Like it's a really interesting lie, this wearing of the mask of love as a way of covering over an underlying animosity, resentment, and hatred. He at other points, see, Nietzsche is not such a superficial thinker that he says like, lie, bad, truth, good. Lie, bad. Like Tarzan talk. Lie, bad, lie, bad, lie, bad, truth, good. good truth, truth good. Like, he's not that dumb, you know? So he can appreciate the aesthetic of a brilliant lie. And for him, you know, Christian morality embodies that aesthetic, like a really sort of ornate, beautiful lie, you know? So he can appreciate the beauty of a clever lie. And, you know, not everyone can, but then again, not everyone's a free-range thinker either. And I think that Nietzsche was, in many ways, a free-range thinker. So he's willing to acknowledge the beauty of a clever lie. And moreover, he says on the side of master morality, well, you know, there's something just too simplistic and childlike about that. Like, it's too damn straightforward. So from his point of view, you know, life is made more interesting because there are, you know, powerful, subtle, tricky lies. Like, from his point of view, like, Christian morality is like that. So it's not like it detracts from life. In fact, from his point of view, it's an enhancement of life. You know, the mendacity of slave morality is actually an enhancement of life. Now, because he's interested in, final point, because he's interested in overcoming and not merely a regression, I think the ultimate upshot of this analysis is not to invite us to regress back to the master morality of antiquity, but ultimately to come up with some new synthesis, all right? Not to rest easily in slave morality, not to rest easily in the master morality of antiquity, but to come up with a new synthesis that ultimately overcomes both of those. And if you really want to be a free-range thinker and perceiver of life, well, I mean, what deeper task can you think of than that one? You know, not to defer easily to the position of slave and not to defer easily to the position of master either, but to seek out a terrain that lies far beyond that particular binary distinction. A new synthesis, a new creative and ultimately artistic act carried out along that deep, inscrutable terrain of values and ultimately how we relate to life. Okay, so this ends this lecture. Sorry, I was a little verbose perhaps at points, but people have been telling me in the comments that, well, I like your little digressions, so maybe I'll feel a little freer to do that. At any rate, I hope you have a great day. It's a beautiful, I'm looking out the window, it's a beautiful sunny day here in Georgia today, and I hope you get to enjoy it. Take care. Bye-bye.